My name is Emma Clark from the Brooklyn Public Library, and I'm sitting down with Kenneth Mahon and Yvette Soto from the Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg. So thank you for being here today. And I'm going to start off by asking both of you how long you have either lived and worked in the neighborhood.
Well, I was born and raised in the neighborhood. I was born in 1964. I lived in the neighborhood until 1991, and then I moved to Bay Ridge, and I've been there since. And still employed here in Williamsburg, so I've technically not left the neighborhood. It's always been a part of my life in one way, shape, or form.
How many years you worked for the bank?
I've been working with the bank 30 plus years. And I'll let it go at that.
The reason I mentioned that to Yvette is I started working for the bank in 1980, and the following year I had hired Yvette. We had some neighborhood people working here at the bank, and we were looking for some part-timers, and Yvette was still in high school. She was 16 years old when she started working here at the bank, right? And
yes, that's correct.
So she's been working here with us for a long time, and I've had her really for most of the time I've been at the bank. I started as assistant controller, and now I'm chief operating officer of the bank, and Yvette and I and some others here at the bank are working on the 150-year history of the Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, which has been pretty interesting. So we learned a little bit about the Puerto Rican migration to Williamsburg, right?
In the 1950s, my family came during that period, and they met here, they married here, and they lived in the neighborhood all their entire lives, my grandparents included, aunts and uncles. So as the years went by, they left, but my parents remained here because my mom was the oldest, so she basically held everybody together. And so that was the beginning of our history in the neighborhood. But everyone has moved along, but I'm still here. Work-wise, and seeing the changes that have been happening have just been amazing, and really it makes me happy to see that it's come a long way.
Speaking of, when I got here in 1980, I was interviewed first. The fellow who hired me is still here today with the bank. It's Mike Devine, and he's here with the bank. If I'm here 35 years, he's here 40 years now. And he interviewed me first over in Manhattan, and then a few days later he asked me to come back for a second interview over here to Williamsburg. And I've never been to Williamsburg before. And when I got here, I came here the day before just to see where it was, so I could figure out where the office was located. And when I got here, I said to myself, "There's no way I'm taking the job in this neighborhood." The neighborhood was just probably at its worst during those years. I mean,
compared to what it is now.
Yeah, for those years and the 8 years that followed it, I mean, the cars, burned out cars on the corner, and the abandoned building. Oh,
lots, empty lots.
Yeah, and you grew up through that period,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
From the mid '60s to through the mid '80s. Really, that was your whole period growing up.
Yes.
But even then, there was, in fact, probably in those days, I think between the Latinos, mostly Puerto Rican, I guess, in those days, and the Hasidim, we used to call Broadway the DMZ, basically demilitarized zone, because that Broadway was really a big line of demarcation between the Hasid on one side and the Latino on this side. And but I didn't really see too much of that. I mean, I guess there was fighting and so forth, mainly over housing in those years,
From what I recall, yes, there was, but it was, and it had a lot to do when the projects were going up. That type of stuff. But we were lucky enough that we owned our own home, so I don't know too much about that, but from what I can recall, there was a little bit of stress going on because.
Yeah, natural stress.
I think so.
But so anyway, really through the '80s, that's what most of New York City was like. And then, I know there was still a lot of people don't like to hear this, but Rudy Giuliani changed the entire. There were two things that happened in Williamsburg that made Williamsburg what it is today. One is when Giuliani became the mayor and just literally cleaned up the city. I mean, you didn't see broken cars around anymore. All the issues we're still talking about today, the quality of life issues, that started when Giuliani got in. It really changed the neighborhood, and it suddenly became, it wasn't yet a desirable place to be. But then through the '90s, you started to see some of the artists and so forth move out of the Lower East Side and come over here because we still had all these factories back from Williamsburg's industrial era, and they started to rent them out as lofts in those days. The Latinos still they as you point out, they owned a lot of homes and some of the multifamily apartments here, but it was still, the neighborhood really hadn't become what it is today, the new Williamsburg that it is today. Through the 90s, it was still a lot of that. It didn't change until 2005 when Bloomberg changed the zoning laws down here and permitted a lot of residential to be built in areas that were only zoned for commercial and industrial back then. And as soon as that happened, you started seeing tear downs and what you see happening today going on with Domino and so forth. But I would say by the early 2000s, that's when you started to see a lot of the I'm old enough, I refer to them as the blue hair and nose ring crowd, because that's who it was. A lot of tattoos, a lot of nose rings, a lot of pink hair, a lot of purple hair, and that's what we had for many years. Now you're really getting
gentrification.
The upsters, they call them, because the cross between the yuppies and the hipsters. And a lot of young families now down along Kent Avenue. You see strollers all up and down Kent Avenue now, bicycle lanes, and in a matter of 10 years, from 2005 until now, you've had a city grow up in an area that was pretty much abandoned for many years.
No, I agree.
Your mother went to Eastern District High School?
My mother went to Eastern District High School. She graduated from there, and then she became a paraprofessional, and she went on to New York City Technical College. From there, she went on to Hunter College, and then she got her master's from Pace. So she was
all on her own.
All
Go
on
get
her
her.
own.
Yeah.
She's a great example. Great example.
Yeah.
And I know you mentioned that you guys are celebrating your 150th.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about the work you've been doing around that, and maybe some of the things you found about the bank's history here in Williamsburg?
Sure. Well, I'll give you the migration uphill here first, and then Yvette can talk a little bit about what you found in the minute books. But the bank was originally founded down where Giando's is now. There's the restaurant right at the foot of Broadway. That street, which stops now at Kent Avenue, used to go straight down to the water, and that's where all the ferries were before the bridge got built. So in the 19th century, savings banks were, I keep referring to them as the dot-coms of today. Savings banks were, there was no place for people who had just a few dollars to save any money. So you'll hear names like Dime and so forth, and some of Germania, which they're all ethnic and names that are meant to evoke where people could come in and save a dime or a quarter and get good rate of interest on it, because the commercial banks didn't want those people as customers. So you had this enormous increase in mutual savings banks in the 19th century. Dime was one of them. So when we were formed, it was just basically one room, and it was set up in the basement of a commercial bank down by the ferry, down at the foot of Broadway. And that was in 1864. By 1873, they had gotten big enough to require their own space, and they moved up to the corner of Wyeth and Broadway. That building isn't there any longer now. Actually, if you see a picture of that building, there's a picture of it actually. If you were to look at that building today, it reminds you very much of there's an arts building now. What is it?
It's
museum?
kind of like an open space museum type of space.
Also, it's on the corner of Driggs. That building is almost identical to the one that still stands today.
Mm-hmm.
The one that's down there now on the corner of Driggs and Broadway was the Kings County Savings Institution.
Mm-hmm.
Our building was about 2 blocks further west on Broadway. And then that was in 1873, we moved in there. And then 1903, the Williamsburg Bridge was built. And suddenly, people weren't going down to that part of Broadway any longer, and the bank was starting to realize they were gonna lose their customer base. So they bought this property on Havemeyer Street, and we bought it in 1906, and then they put the building up in 1908, and we've been here ever since. So that's the migration of the buildings. But why don't you talk a little bit about the minutes, what you found in it?
All sorts of interesting little tidbits, things that in this day and age really no one would think to put in there. We had this one woman who fell down a coal chute. And she sued the bank for $50
Oh my goodness.
back then in the day for her clothing and her medical expenses. And so after that happened, we went out and got liability insurance because we didn't have any until then. Let's see.
The robbery.
There was the robbery in 1869.
Right.
And that was a big one. They stole about $8,000 altogether with cash and bonds. Which, with conspiracy theorists that we are, we think it's an inside job.
Yeah, that's what I thought. when I read a description in the minutes, what would you say, 1869 that happened?
Yeah.
And they described the whole thing,
And they
right?
described the whole thing. There was the secretary was moving cash out of the vault, and someone knocked on the door, so he went to see who was at the door. When he went to, open the door, he came back, he noticed that the box was gone. And so a little German boy allegedly found the box, and the box was crushed, but everything was gone. So that was our first robbery in 1869. And back then, that was a lot of money and a lot of value.
And these are all recorded? You can
Yeah.
all use records?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
We have the books, we have signature books, we have the very first signature book. When people came in, they used to have, and even the handwriting, right? In the
Yes.
minutes, everything was handwritten. When
Everything
did
was
you start
handwritten.
seeing typewritten minutes?
Oh, must have been in early 1900s, maybe 1911, something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
And back then, unfortunately, we lost a lot of our records because we didn't have copy machines, we didn't have scanners, there were no, iClouds or anything like that. So they ended up selling about 5 tons of paper that they were storing in the basement, which was a fire hazard, for $28.10.
$28. Now here we are scrambling this year to find historical records, and Yvette just told me about this. Or she reminded me. I guess she read it when she saw the minutes,
Mm-hmm.
and she just reminded me of it recently. And I tell you, it breaks your heart because you're thinking, my God, they must have thrown out stuff that today, as we're putting together the history of the bank,
It would have been so
would have been
useful.
useful, right? And
Yeah.
although you did find the family album, right?
I did, yes, with
What was
our
it?
original trustees, going back
How
to
many pages was that book?
It's a photograph book, and it's got about maybe 30 pages of it, and there are some are blank, but it has pictures of our first president. Actually, past the first 3 presidents.
Yeah.
The originator of the bank was William Grandy. Let's see what else.
Actually,
Okay.
those pictures, they must have been taken around the turn of the century because, I mean, even the Brooklyn Times doesn't have photos until later on. So,
It doesn't say when they were taken, but we do have. It must have been sometime between the 1870s, I would say, and the early
Yeah.
1900s. And maybe some early 19th century, because you can see the change in the outfits and the men's clothes. They were more tailored towards the end than were before. They had the big, mutton chops and sideburns and things like that.
the vacuum cleaner.
The vacuum cleaner.
Don't you tell that story,
That
yeah.
was in the early 1900s. That was also in the minutes. They debated whether or not to buy a vacuum cleaner 1 month, and then the following month they decided to reject it because it wasn't practicable.
Imagine
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
It's too impractical to buy a vacuum cleaner.
To buy a
right?
vacuum cleaner.
So, but that's the kind of stuff that used to make it to the minutes in those days. And it's even when they had directors pass away, the flowery
Obituaries.
language that they
Yeah.
would put in the minutes.
Beautiful obituaries.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So that was very interesting. The signature books, which are extraordinary by themselves, you go through and you can see what people's occupations were, and they'd have to list their parents' occupation. And there were several striking ones, but the one I think that is most memorable to all of us is one fella wrote down that his father's occupation was slave. And I tell you, if that kind of drives home to you, really. And this was the 1860s, it's just kind of amazing stuff.
Tinsmith or Milner or
Oh, yeah,
seamstress
yeah.
or they did all sorts of metal work, or they worked in refineries and things like that, oil companies and.
Williamsburg itself, if you look at the housing stock even today, you can see the dividing line. Broadway on the, I guess it would be the south side of Broadway, that's where all the brownstones still exist, where the Hasidim still live. If you walk up and down those streets, you see a lot of brownstones still from the 19th century. When you get over to this side, a lot of frame homes, a lot of industrial, that's where all the industrial buildings are. And any of these brand new buildings that went up, they generally knocked down some old frame buildings that had been there for however long. But you can see it in the housing stock. So the wealthy people, this is even before the days of automobiles. Any of the wealthy people used to live here, and they would vacation out on Long Island. So you'll go. This is where the Brooklyn Daily Eagle was great as a resource. You could see that some of the fellows who were managers or directors of the bank, they had their homes here over on Rodney Street, or up and down Division Avenue here. But then they'd say, during the summer they were out on Long Island. They'd go to Bayshore, or one of the towns out there, and they would use horse and buggy to get there. It's funny because we have a picture of the bank where they still have a watering trough in front of the bank in 1900. Wow. And you stop, you don't realize that, in 1908 they were still using horses back then. It doesn't seem that long ago. So the whole thing has been quite an experience, kind of developing the story. But in those days, the Germans they really owned this area. It wasn't until the bridge was built And it's funny what you could say and maybe sad in a way too, I guess, what they could say in the newspaper in those days that you wouldn't dream about saying today. But they were talking about after the bridge was built, all the Jews from the Lower East Side moved over here and just forced everybody out. What they meant was they forced all the rich Germans out is what happened, and it became a community of Jews. And then later on, Yvette and I, we sort of pieced together the story of how the Latinos came here, because along the water, if you go back and look, where Domino Sugar was, it wasn't just Domino Sugar. There were a dozen small sugar refiners up and down along the river. I mean, sugar was huge in this area, and they eventually made sugar, the importation of sugar, so expensive that they started to substitute corn syrup, and it drove out anybody that lived down in the islands. Their industry went away because the United States stopped importing sugarcane from the islands. And that led to the migration of the Puerto Ricans and Dominicans from the islands up to New York, because there were jobs here. There were still industrial jobs here around the Second World War and into the 50s. So that was because we talked about how did you end up with all the Latinos in this community. But when you go back in again, all this stuff is in the paper, but you can piece it all together. And through all of it, the book we're writing now, we decided to call the book "The Last Bank Standing," because we're the last Brooklyn savings bank headquartered still here in Brooklyn. Most of them have gone away. I mean, I've got a list of 21 banks here that were banks in the 19th century that no longer exist. Half of them are now branches of Chase Manhattan or HSBC or a couple other banks. Some of them have just gone away altogether. But through it all, for whatever reason, the Dime Savings Bank is still here in the main office that we put up 100 years ago. So it's been a lot of fun through that part.
Why do you think the Dime has been able to last so long in this community?
My latest answer has been we're just lazy. We decided never to move out of, we couldn't really decide where we wanted to go, and
if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Right, that's pretty much the way it happened. And the reason we survived all those years too is because we became a multifamily lender, so we lend on a lot of pre-war apartment houses, anywhere from about 20 units up to about 100. That's our stock in trade, if you look at the loan portfolio today. And New York City is still a place where you have multifamily housing. I mean, that's so it's been a great asset for us to be involved in. We don't do a lot of stupid things in terms of lending. We lend really on low loan to value buildings where the rents are low. A lot of our buildings are still buildings where low and moderate income people can afford to live, whether it's Brooklyn or Manhattan. A bigger portion of our lending is Manhattan, then another huge portion is here in Brooklyn, and to a smaller extent out in Queens. We have branches out there as well. But even the management here, I in the book we refer to as corporate DNA, because the old Germans were very, very conservative people, and I think to myself that generation after generation just hires people like them. And I think in a way that DNA that formed the company in the first place kind of carried on through all those years here. And, we had a couple of close calls. I mean, the bank itself was like a cat with 9 lives. I mean, there were a couple of times where the place nearly went out of business. Back in the early 80s, around the time Yvette got here, thank God she wasn't paying attention to the balance sheet. She would have quit. She would have quit back then. But there was a time during the early 80s when interest rates went up so high that the tabloids, whether it was the New York Times or the Daily News, they would have columns about how many quarters the savings banks had left of capital before they got put out of business. And the Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, I remember, because I had a young family then, we had the newspaper said there were 5 quarters of capital left before we got put out of business. And I thought, all right, what am I going to do for a job when this was about 1982 or 3? What am I going to do for a job then? And suddenly, by the beginning of 1983, interest rates calmed down. The bank started making some money, and we got very profitable from then until, then there was another period in the early 90s where real estate got bad. But we didn't have those problems in the 90s. This place almost went out of business in the 70s when those were the John Lindsay days when the city was broke, and Jerry Ford said to New York City, drop dead. That whole, you probably may have, I don't know if you'd remember that.
I recall that,
probably not.
1975.
So, yeah, okay. So there was a period then where the city was broke, and real estate was just being abandoned. People wouldn't pay on their loans anymore. And the bank went through a very, very, we have letters upstairs from the New York State Banking Department, which basically say to us, they instruct the board that you people should start looking around for a combination partner because by rights you really ought to be out of business. And we had a fella then, this is what we're going to put in the book too, there was a Polish fella named Joe Ujazdowski who came into the bank, and he was the number 2 guy here for a while. And then right in that period, they put him in charge of the company, and he was stubborn. He was like a bulldog, basically, and just they wouldn't let the bank go out of business. And the bank, 10 years later was around, and we got through the interest rate period. And then from there on in, it's been really just profitable and prudent investing, conservative managers. And, we don't have the notoriety that a lot of banks around us had over those years, but because of that, I think we still survive.
We're still here and they're not.
Yeah, well, there you go, right? That's right.
Do either of you have any particularly vivid memories of your time working in this neighborhood, or challenging moments? Anything you want to talk about that stands out?
He's my boss.
Anything you can say with me here?
Challenging moments here?
Or particularly vivid memories, things that just really stand out in your time.
Oh,
in this
geez.
neighborhood.
Well, I can tell you one incident, a particular incident that I remember. We were still. The main office here at 209 Havemeyer was built in 2 parts. The first 2 columns were built in 1908, as far back as the first 2 columns. Then in 1925, they came back and built the rest of the building. Now, you wouldn't know that if you stood outside the building. It all looks like it was built at the same time. But that building it's basically walls, and the inside isn't supported by anything. The columns are there, but they're false columns. They don't really hold the building up. And the building looks very secure and like it's never going to fall over. But one day, and this could have been back in 1982 maybe, if you go back and look through the archives, you'll see they started to do work on the Williamsburgh Bridge, because the bridge was really they thought it was going to fall into the river at one point. So they had welders up there. And it was one morning, could have been about 11 o'clock in the morning, and all of a sudden, we feel the building, like an earthquake. The building's rocking back and forth. And your first instinct is get up and what's happening, but you can't, if you've ever been in an earthquake, you know what the sensation is like. And this just went on for, what couldn't have been very long, maybe 20 seconds, 30 seconds tops. And we're all like, what the heck went on? And we're on the 2nd floor when that happened, so the shaking was even worse. And so we turn on the radio to listen to the news, and sure enough, what they talk about is there was a barge that was floating under the Williamsburgh Bridge, and the welders, apparently there was some piece of welding that had fallen down and hit the barge, and exploded the barge, and the barge just blew up. People died in that thing, and that barge kind of floated down to the bottom of the river, and it's probably still at the bottom of Wallabout Bay over here where Giando's is located. It just floated down off into the river, and it was that was probably the most exciting moment I had in all my years at the bank. So, anything else Williamsburg-wise that growing up, or the bank hired you? That was 3 times we hired you, right?
You learned your lesson, didn't you?
Well, we hired her when she was 16. Then she got married and moved away. Then she came back for a while, and she came back. You came back to the bank then.
I came back in 1991, and I've been here since. I went to St. Peter and Paul Elementary School, and then from there I went to Cathedral in Manhattan. Prior to that, St. Angelo Hall, also in Brooklyn, but they closed down. And then I went to Catherine Gibbs, and but I've always been a neighborhood girl. Everywhere I look, I kind of remember I was there with my grandmother, I was there with my mom. I remember when that store used to be, when that building used to be this store, and that building used to be this store, and so it was sad to kind of see all of that go away, but at the same time it's interesting to see the new life that's coming into the neighborhood. It's just it's odd to see how things evolve, but they're evolving in a good way. That's kind of my take on it.
One of the people, maybe at some point, if you're interested, he's not here today. It would have been nice to have him sit in or have a separate interview with him. Is Mike Devine. His family, Jewish family, of course, I think his original name was Devinitz when they first moved over here. Michael Devine, when I first met, he's the one who hired me. When I first met him, I thought he was Irish. In fact, everybody thinks he's Irish. But at any rate, Mike lived here. He was
Pulaski Street.
Yeah, right. And his father was a house painter, and his father at one time painted the spire up on the top of the Williamsburg Savings Bank across from Peter Luger's. That's the kind of ties that he had, they have to the neighborhood. So Mike's the only one that actually kind of grew up here other than the vet in the neighborhood. The rest of us are from either other parts of Brooklyn. I'm from New Jersey. Just happened to say, I actually never expected I would spend 35 years of my life in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, but I have. And it's been really a lot of fun watching it. When I first got here, there were only 3 or 4 places to have anything to eat. Peter Luger's was one of them, and then there were three Italian restaurants. Kono's was one, which is gone now, and then Bramonti's, which is still here.
And Milo's was the other.
Milo's was another nice,
Milo's
but
was another
yeah,
nice place.
sort of. There were still a lot of it. The old Italians were around here, but and there still are really when you sort of get up to the north side. A lot of Italian families still live up there.
As someone who grew up here, what about this neighborhood is unique to you?
What is unique? Gosh. I'll think of all these answers once the interview is over, because right now I feel like I'm being put on the spot. But
Was it when were you growing up? Was it just Latino and
back then it was mostly Hispanic. It was a lot of Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. That was basically the neighborhood, and everybody got along, and everywhere you went, there was little vegetable stands and supermarkets and bodegas, and there was the period when I was growing up. I remember we had the gangs and things like that, but that kind of like was on the other side of Bedford Ave. There were like areas where they were like concentrated that we just never went to.
Your mother wouldn't let you go out at night anyway, would she?
Yeah, growing up, we weren't even allowed to like have sleepovers or anything. You sleep in your own bed. That's it. That's the end of the story. But there's still some of that, that flavor to me in the neighborhood. I mean, it's shrunk and it's gotten smaller. But to me, I'm glad that it's still here. And I'm proud that I'm a product of this neighborhood. I'm proud of my achievements. I was just promoted in September. I've been here a long time. I've seen a lot of faces. I've seen a lot of changes. But it just makes me happy to look around and again just remember, because the memories that they don't go away. You always carry them with you.
There are a few community organizations here in the neighborhood which are trying to. I'm listening to Yvette talk about this, and one of the things that makes the neighborhood attractive, which I think is becoming less and less, is diminishing now, is the presence of the Latino population in the area. I mean, it's really. They're down now to maybe about 6 or 8 square blocks, really off of when you get to the other side of Brinkman Place over there. And really the real estate is so expensive now that it's very hard for them. But we've got a few organizations here that the Dime works with. One is Los Sures, which is across the street, and then Brooklyn Neighborhood Services, and El Puente. NHS is more city, but between Los Sures and El Puente and Brooklyn Legal Services, they are always out there fighting to make sure people don't get evicted from their homes, because a lot of these building owners they know they can get more money for the apartments, and so listen. I think it's fair to say that some of them do make it hard for for what, let's call it, the indigenous population, to stay here, and the shame of it is if you lose that, you lose the character of what attracted people to Williamsburg in the first place. So I think they've got to make sure there's a place for that. I mean, Dime does lending in those kind of properties. So for us, that's what we'd like to see. That we'd like to see that continue in the neighborhood. So we'll see what happens over the next few years. It's just there's so many new buildings going up and new services, which is all great. But then you start to lose the character of especially you go down now along Kent Avenue with all the new buildings down there. It is just, I mean, I got to tell you, if I don't go down there. If I don't go down along Kent Avenue for a month or two, there's something new there that I haven't seen before. That's how quickly the construction's going up. But the nice thing is that still, I mean, here across the street from us, when you go out of the building later, you'll see there's a building going up there now. It's going to be a 12 or 13-story building, where it used to be a 2-story industrial bakery called Spilky's, where they made fruitcakes and matzahs, and that was there forever. But now it's going to be residential, and I imagine some, we have parking lots here. I wouldn't be surprised if one day that turns into residential too, But we still would like to stay here for. I mean, this is where to imagine to be here for 150 years, and it doesn't make sense to be pulling up roots now.
I'm curious about Dime's involvement with the community. Do you have patrons who have been here for decades or things like that?
Patrons of the bank.
Yeah.
We have customers of the bank that have been here for a long time. We had a few months ago. We had four of our depositors who've been here for more than 30 years. So we have customers that have been around for. We actually have a woman who's the Latina that she lives in the Bronx now, but she has her account here at main office.
Her name is Carmen. I don't remember. I don't recall her last name.
Yeah.
But she was banking here, and I think she's over at the Bronx now. But
yeah. So we do have customers that have been around for a long time, and we have the landlords who know the bank too. I mean, they've been with us for more than a generation. Many of them, because a lot of the landlords that we do business with anyway are intergenerational owners. So the grandfather owned properties, and they gave them to the kids, who gave them to the grandchildren, and that's a lot of them still have loans with us. It's been, but other than that, I said to Yvette, there was a building down here over on Rodney Street and Division, I think, that used to be called the Hanover Club, because it was a social club back in the 19th century up until, I guess, through what you would call the Gilded Age here in Williamsburg, and that's where all the old Germans and politicians and they all used to meet there at night, because there was no television, there was nowhere to go. Everybody lived in the neighborhood. They would go to the club and have drinks or play billiards or something else, and that was the element that was Williamsburg, and that really, I guess, was they were the board members of the bank for many years.
Now tell me about this book that you're putting together. What is that about?
Well, back in 1914, I only have the first 10 pages here. And I'll tell you a funny story about this. Back in 1914, the managers of the bank in those days wrote a book called the 50th Anniversary of the Dime. And so when we came up onto our 150th anniversary, I said to the folks I work with, what, we really should put together another book for the 150 year. So what does Yvette find that she's going through the minutes back at the 100-year anniversary of the bank in 1964? The board was discussing it and decided, let's write a book about the 100-year anniversary. And that's the only reference she ever saw it. They never wrote a book. Nothing ever came out.
Did anything about it.
Yeah. So now we decided to make the 150-year anniversary book, but
they probably stopped because they came across the same situation that we did. They didn't have anything to go by because they had already destroyed the information. So they just threw their hands up and let it go.
I know, but like when you write in your family history, your family tree, now you wish that, I wish my grandfather was alive because he could take me back 2 generations. Sure. If they had done it in 1964, there was that whole infill period that we don't have as much information as we ought to. Yeah. It's the same thing. If they had done it, would have been great. So that was the 50-year book, and we decided to write the 150-year book for that primarily for that reason. But we're working with a creative director and a researcher to do some work for us, so this fellow goes to the Brooklyn Public Library of all things, and what does he find? The leather-bound version of that book. Yeah, they only printed 50 copies of that book, and the book is still over there at the Brooklyn Public Library. And I hope somebody over there never throws it out, because it really is an artifact. If they're going to throw it out, tell them to call us. We'll be happy to take it off their hands. But when this book is finished, we're going to give copies to the Brooklyn Public Library too, so you have it there. But it's a great weaving of the story for 150 years, and we're not talking just about the Dime Savings Bank, but the history does have some of what we're talking about today: the immigration of Latinos and the Hasidim when they came over here, and what the neighborhood was like back in the 19th century. Yeah. So the sugar industry, which was enormous, and really there were so many banks in the 19th century and up through the early part of the 20th century because New York State did not allow branch banking. So if a neighborhood wanted a bank to be nearby, they really had to start their own bank. They couldn't, you couldn't have. I should talk about the Dime Savings Bank in New York too, because there was a lot of listeners, a lot of people who come across this Dime Savings Bank are going to think, didn't they get sold? Well, that was the Dime Savings Bank of New York, which was originally the Dime Savings Bank of Brooklyn, which was located on Fulton Street. That building is still there. If you think over where Junior's is, there's a block behind, I guess it's Nassau and Fulton down there?
No, Albee. It's I think
DeKalb, maybe?
DeKalb,
Yeah. And there's a building there which was the Dime Savings Bank of Brooklyn. But when these companies were formed back in the 19th century, it wasn't really a problem having a dime over there and a dime over here. In fact, Williamsburg itself was its own city until 1855 or 1853, so it wouldn't have been unusual for a bank to come along, call itself the Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, because in those days Williamsburg still considered itself, even though they merged with Brooklyn and became one part. Yeah, there was still a lot of patriotism about jingoism, I guess, about this community. And if you look at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle for those years, all through the rest of the 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century, it was always Eastern District. You'll see them refer to themselves as the Eastern District because they felt very strongly about what was going on here in this community. So that's how we ended up having two dime savings banks. And eventually, when the Dime of Williamsburg went public in 1996, the Dime of New York, they changed their name from Dime of Brooklyn to Dime of New York later on, somewhere along the line, but they turned around and sued us because we had the same name as them. So they enjoined us from doing certain things. We had to be careful. We always had to use of Williamsburg in our name anytime we advertised. That was one of the things they required. And I remember Mike Devine and I, when we went to when we were going through the judicial hearing with them, they sued us, so we had to go back, and they wanted to settle out. The judge really wanted us to settle the case out of court, so we went back and forth with the Dime of New York. I should put this in the book, actually, now that I think of it. So Mike Devine and I said, when we finally came to settlement day, we said, okay, this is the agreement. We're going to hammer out that we're both going to sign it today. We were shaking hands with them. Everybody was unhappy, and Mike said to them, yeah, well, you know what? We'll be around a lot longer than you are. And 5 years later, they were out of business, and here we are, 15 years later, still doing business, right? So, Mike was kind of a prophet when it came to that. But I said now we can just call ourselves Dime because there is no other Dime here in New York anyway.
Is there anything else you guys would like to add? Final thoughts?
No, this was a lot of fun.
I think we covered everything.
Read the book, right?
Thank you so much for your time.
Ellen, thank you
Thank you
very
ever so
much
much.
for
Very
asking us to participate.